Alright, econ students, here we go. A little bit of a late test prep here for ADAS and fiscal policy. Here is our sheet, all the things you are to know down the line. Let's move on here, okay? A couple things. So how does the government stabilize the economy? Through two different tools in its toolbox. It can use either fiscal policy, which is taxing and spending. The Congress does this, or the president through the passage of laws, or monetary policy, which we said is faster, we're going to get to next week at that point. So looking at fiscal policy, there's two main types of fiscal policy. Discretionary, where the government can pass laws changing AD through taxing and spending. The problem is the time lag. Congress needs to recognize there's a problem, Great Recession, yada, yada, yada. The other thing is non-discretionary fiscal policy. That's where there's automatic stabilizers automatically built into the economy that will work counter-cyclically to stabilize what's going on. Welfare, unemployment, we'll get into this a little bit deeper as we move on here. So two types of fiscal policy, discretionary and non-discretionary. So when we talk about our car analogy, when the economy is running too hot and we're all the way out here, past long run, okay, there's YFE, there's where we are right now. We have to slow the economy back. Well, we want a contractionary fiscal policy because right now we're in an inflationary gap, and here is our gap right here. Government spending should go down, taxes should go up, and that ought to bring us back to where we ought to be. Vice versa, if we're in a recessionary gap, and here is YFE, and here is where we are, and there's our gap, we need to improve the economy and increase aggregate demand so that we get to that point. Government spending ought to go up, and taxes ought to go down. Now the question of fiscal policy always has to look at is, how much should the government spend? And we talked about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Remember that some of the money was tax relief, and the rest of it was government spending. So, what type of gap do we have, and what type of policy is best? If we have this gap right here, and we want to get to long run, how do we get there? The gap is $100 billion between these two. Should we spend $100 billion? No, because then AD would then move out here, and we don't want that to happen. So what do? We have to figure out the spending multiplier. Start with the MPC. Okay? Change in consumption over change in income. Income in these three problems is we're receiving $100, so it's always over 100. So for example, the first one is 50 over 100 or 0.5, 0.8, 1, easy enough. Okay? If we figure out the MPC, then we ought to be able to figure out the MPS, because MPC plus MPS equals 1. So a simple math problem here. Okay? So if you received 100, you say 50. It's 50 over 100 or 0.5. So there's our multiplier. To figure out the multiplier, you put 1 over the MPS, and that will basically tell you how much you have, your money will be multiplied by spending it in the economy. Okay? So if the MPC is 0.9, that means our MPS is 0.1. 1 over 0.1 is 10, right? 0.8, that's 1 over 0.2, which is, do the math, I believe it's 5. Okay, if it's 0.5, then the multiplier is 2, and yada, yada, yada. Okay? So you can figure out all these problems and figure out the multiplier effect at that point. You should be able to do that. That's easy enough. Okay? So, what type of gap do we have? If this is our gap, and we want to get to long run, we are in what type of gap? We are in a recessionary gap. We need expansionary policy. Two options. Taxes can go down. Government spending can go up. How much initial government spending is needed? Well, how do we figure that out? The gap that we need to get to, if we use the multiplier, if it's 0.8. So 1 over, the MPS is 0.2. If it's 1 over 1/5, 1 times 5 is 5. Okay, we need $500 billion. 500 billion divided by 5 is, we need $100 billion to close the gap. This should be easy enough. Okay? Now looking at this one, vice versa, this is where we are right here. We want to get back to this point. Okay, so what type of gap are we in? We are in an inflationary gap. Okay, we need contractionary fiscal policy. Taxes should go up, government spending should go down. How much is needed to close the gap? Well, the distance is $20 billion. The MPC is 0.5.
Would Nicole Sarkwa at Elaine Pastorero please call 7237, please?
1 over 0.5 is 2. Okay, so I need 20 billion, which means I need to stop spending or raise taxes by about 10 billion in some way, shape, or form there. Okay? Now, here's the problem with taxes, though. Remember that if you give someone a tax break, if you cut taxes, they should get, their multiplier would be 0.25. But the problem is they save some of that money. Their marginal propensity to save is 0.25. They're going to save a quarter of it. So if you give a $4 million tax cut, only $3 million is going to be multiplied back in the economy. So taxes have less of an impact than direct government spending. Remember, the tax multiplier is MPC over MPS, or the spending multiplier minus 1. Two easy ways to figure that out. Okay? So let's do one practice problem here. If the MPC is 0.5, that means the spending multiplier is 1 over 0.5, or 2. Remember, we take 2 minus 1, which means the tax multiplier is 1. What do we have to do? We have to increase to this point. So, how much do we increase government spending? The gap is 20 billion. So, if we're cutting taxes, we need to cut taxes by 20 billion. If it's government spending, we only need to increase government spending by 10 billion because we get more bang for the buck at that point. Okay? And there's some practice problems here. I'll stop for a second. You guys can work on this. Hit pause now. Okay, moving on. The automatic stabilizer we built in, make sure you go over this. When GDP is up, more tax burden on consumers, discourage consumption, so AD comes back down. When GDP is down, tax burden on consumers goes down, so more people jump in. This helps stabilize the economy and not have negative impacts throughout. The problems with fiscal policy, the number one problem is that damn Congress. It's all these lag times. Noticing there's a problem, doing something about it, voting about it. Remember, politicians are in to get reelected. This crowding out effect. We talked about a new library. So the government creates a new library, so AD ought to go up, building the library, but the problem is people now spend less on books, so AD comes back down. Okay? This crowding out effect always affects consumer or investment spending because the government will do it. Likewise, if the dollar appreciates and gets strong, price levels go up, foreign countries buy less. That's why you see today a lot of people traveling abroad to buy stuff abroad. Remember the 4 graphs that we talked about, the shifts of AD and then how it affects the Phillips curve. We were at equilibrium here, and all of a sudden AD moved out. Okay, so unemployment would go down, inflation would go up. That's where it was before. Inflation is now there. That's where unemployment was. That's where it is now. Likewise, if AD moves in, price levels are going to drop. So that's where we were before. That's where we are now. You can see inflation went down, unemployment went up on our Phillips curve. Remember, if it's an aggregate supply shift, a decrease in aggregate supply, there's stagflation. Both price levels and unemployment are going to go up. So we can't be on this curve. Where do we have to be? We have to be on a new curve. Because inflation will only go up and unemployment will only go out. So we pick a spot, put it right there, that's where we are. That's all I got. Good luck on a test. Go Tigers.